In this video, we are answering your questions about canopy piloting. From tips and tricks for stand-up landings, being more accurate on your landings as well, knowing when you're ready to downsize, and some exercises you can do to get ready for swooping. Coming up right now. What's up, Skydivers? It's Catherine here from Skydive Vibes, sharing the passion of skydiving and helping you become better and safer skydivers. So if you're new here, consider subscribing not to miss any of our videos all about skydiving. So I'm super excited for this video because not only we are gonna answer your questions, but we also have an experienced canopy coach to answer them. Germain is an experienced skydiving instructor, and he is also an author of many great books about canopy piloting and skydiving. So Brian did accept to join us here today to answer your questions. I did ask you what were your questions on canopy piloting on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. By the way, if you're not following me on those platforms, you should go check me out there. And you sent out a ton of questions, but in the end, you guys were actually asking 5 main questions. So I did submit them to Brian, and he gladly answered those for you. So now I'm done here. Brian, it is your turn.
Hello, Skydive Vibes viewers. I'm Brian Germain, and I was asked to answer a number of questions, and I'm going to go ahead and attack them now.
So first question for you, what are some skills I need to master under canopy in order to be ready to downsize?
All right, things that I think you should work on. Obviously, the ability to flare your parachute for landing is the most important skill of all. And so the ability to achieve level flight and fly that parachute to as slow as possible speed without significant roll angle, without letting up on the toggles, where you really finish it up in an attitude, a body pitch attitude, where you're able to instantly start running at the moment you land. And so that is actually quite a different thing from one canopy to the next, because the length of the brake lines varies, the response distance, if you will, to achieve level flight, the speed that you have to move your hands, it varies. And so I think before you downsize, you got to be able to land what you got beautifully. And you can make all the excuses you want, but conditions vary, and if you can't nail it every time in low winds, medium winds, and high winds, it's definitely it doesn't make any sense to downsize. And of course, the other tool that we have for measuring how competent somebody is under canopy is where they land. And to me, where you land, accuracy is also about how did you get there. In other words, did you fly a good pattern, or did you do a sloppy pattern? Maybe you arrived at the pea gravel, but you did 16 S-turns in a spiral and you cut 3 people off. Not okay. So the whole idea is that you got there in a clean manner that was polite for the traffic, it was predictable, and it was what you planned, right? And so I think it's extremely important to have other people film you to obviously look at the landing, but also to look at how well you flew that pattern, and if there's something you could have done better. If you can't hit a target with your current parachute, going smaller to a faster parachute that dives more, most likely, it's not going to be a Band-Aid. It's not going to make things easier for you. It's going to make it harder. It's going to make it more dangerous. So prove to everybody that you can land beautiful. Prove to yourself that you can land where you wanted to. And then go from there. Now, the other thing that I would add to it also is that you've done a whole lot of practice in the low turn methodologies. And this is not something that I can describe very, very quickly. I've spent a lot of times, a lot of my life making videos and teaching about how to turn low properly, all the different ways. But the main thing is that you actually have physically practiced it on your canopy and gotten good at pulling out of low turns, gotten good at pulling up from a dive of some kind. When you go to a smaller and faster parachute, things happen a lot quicker. The ground will show up, the downdraft, for instance, and it's the same kind of thing that you will also experience if you go to a higher elevation, higher density altitude. But you can be flying along on final approach, and suddenly the altitude goes away very, very quickly, and you got to stab your brakes and save yourself. And if you don't do it the right way, you're going to get hurt. And downsizing does much the same thing. It makes things happen faster. There's less time. So there is no short way to answer that question. So that's the best I can do. All right. So let's move on to the next question.
Question number 2, can you give some tips and tricks for stand-up landings?
Well, minimize your descent rate. I mean, really, if you hit the ground hard, if you hit the ground with a whole lot of forward speed, it's going to be harder to stand up. So part of your job in standing up the landing is to fly the parachute well to a low altitude cruise, if you will, where you can touch the ground before you actually are running, right? So that you're cruising across the ground with your feet brushing through the grass. You don't have to touch the ground, but you could, right? So you're close to it. You're low enough to the ground. The completion of the flare process also involves you continually moving your hands down, 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 all the way to the end until you run out of arms or you run out of ground speed, whichever comes first. That's a biggie. Quite often people just stop, at 3/4 breaks and they think, oh, it's done now. And they focus their mind on preparing for impact or preparing to run, and their hands don't finish the job. They don't push all the way down to get that golden nugget of lift at the bottom of the toggle stroke. So the other thing that I would add to this is body position, that being in the correct attitude with respect to the pitch axis, being able to be in balance over the top of your leg straps, loosened chest strap is kind of imperative for this. Flaring towards the back, finishing all the way down by your butt with your hands, kind of near your coccyx bone, ideally more or less, on most parachutes, will set you up to be in a position, attitude-wise, to transition from flying straight into running. And of course, if you plant both feet at the same time, you're likely to face plant or slip onto your butt, depending on where your feet are. So put the first foot down underneath your body, right in the middle, not off to one side. The other foot will sort of dive forward for that next step as that foot and your shoulders dive forward after you've taken that very first step under your coccyx bone, down in the shadow underneath your body, if you will. And then you spring forward with your hands all the way pushing down, down, down behind you as you're diving forward with your shoulders and that other foot into the next step. But planting both feet at the same time causes a lot of people to trip and fall down. And I like to think of it as sort of running down a slack line, that your feet really, you want them to be in line with each other. And so to be flaring and landing with your knees closer together is very helpful for that. If you look like you've been riding a horse for 10 hours, with your knees real far apart, that's going to make it a little bit harder for you to run it out nicely. And you're more likely to tip over from reaching with one leg if your knees are apart. So sit pretty, with your knees together. And I think you'll find that helps a lot too. Lots to talk about with landing beautifully and standing up. But the truth is that standing up is not the most important thing. It's being able to stand up after you're landing because you're not injured. So sometimes you roll, sometimes you slide, sometimes you run it out. Don't be so picky about which one of those avenues you end up taking. The main thing is you fly the parachute to its fullest extent. You fly it all the way to the end of the flare, push, 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 down, 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 all the way to the end, and make sure that by the last third of your flight across the ground in your flare, that you're within touching distance of the ground.
Question 3. How can I be more accurate in my landing? Any tips on planning a good landing pattern?
Where I would start with that one is, first of all, you got to figure out how far your parachute goes across the ground for every 100 feet of descent. Or if you're going to fly a pattern where you have 300-foot legs, in terms of your descent. So for instance, final approach, you're turning in at 300 feet above the ground. How far across the ground are you going to go? So you got to figure that out. Most people are somewhere between 2-to-1 and 3-to-1, but you're going to have to kind of get a rough idea what it is on a no-wind day, what it is on a medium wind day, and what it is on a high wind day. So if your glide ratio is, let's say, 2.5-to-1, kind of an average figure, for the last 100 feet of your descent, you're going to cover 250 feet. If you're going to turn final approach at 300 feet, then you're going to go 750 feet. across the ground. And that's assuming, of course, that you're into the wind and done turning at 300 feet. That's how far it'll go. You lose something in the turn, you lose glide ratio, you accelerate, things get a little bit weird in the turn. It screws up the numbers, but it gives you a rough idea. So flying your pattern so that you intercept that point that will glide you in at that angle, so in other words, I think of it as, the sight picture from my view is only one aspect of my analysis. The other is the side view of that image. How far are you going to go? And so I'm going to draw something for you. I don't normally do this kind of thing. I'm going to draw something for you here that I think you'll find very helpful. So here is your glide ratio, right? So for every, let's say, 100 feet down, you go, let's say maybe it's 2.6 or something like that across the ground, 260 feet. I'm just pulling that number out of my butt. And then you have to recognize, of course, that you're going to lose some, quote, glide ratio, relative glide ratio, because of the headwind. So I'm going to assume that you're facing into the wind for landing. And let's say the wind is 1/3 your ground speed. So the ground speed of your parachute might be 24 miles an hour, let's say. Pull that figure out of my hat. And so, 1/3 of that, so you're maybe, 8 mile an hour wind or something. And so now my glide ratio across the ground is cut down this way. So it's going to give me the ability to interpolate how far across the ground I'm actually going to go, right? That's this component. So today, given that much headwind, and I don't have to do it exactly, but I have a rough idea before I take off, gives me an idea of how far I'm going to go. And then I can go to Google Maps and say, all right, how far is that? And Google Maps is great. You go right click, measure distance, right? So you find your drop zone, maps.google.com. You find your drop zone and you right click, and then you stretch the points out after you click measure distance, and you can actually see in the bottom precisely how far it is. So you know where to intercept that altitude location checkpoint, point it into the wind, and from there you're going to land on that spot that you expected. So that's an awfully good starting point. It's a long answer for a short question, but the truth is that this question, I've made, videos that are, 2 hours long just on this topic. There's much more to talk about here. But this is kind of, a really quick in a nutshell answer that maybe will bump up your understanding, your ability to hit a target. Because if you can't hit a target, it's not just embarrassing. Sometimes it's a real problem. So get good at accuracy, take it seriously, and make it beautiful. Land where you want it to, and beautifully.
Question 4. What are the best canopy inputs I can use to keep my altitude or lose some altitude in my landing pattern?
The first thing that I would like to say is that that if you're a little bit off in the pattern, your greatest tool that you have is to make modifications to the inside or to the outside of the pattern. In other words, if you're a little bit on the low side, you should turn a little bit towards the target. If you're a little bit on the high side, you turn a little bit away from the target. Whether you're on the downwind leg, the base leg, that really will help. And here's why I urge people to lean towards heading as the best way to leverage that, to change where you end up landing, is because if you add brakes or you add something that's going to pick up more speed like front risers, it's going to change your position in the lineup. In other words, you're not alone probably. And if you hit the brakes on, for instance, your base leg, the guy behind you could ram you, especially if they've got target fixation and they're looking at another canopy that they're dealing with, right? And you hit the brakes and you ram them from behind. Now we got a major problem. So keeping your speed about the same in the pattern is a good idea. And yes, it's true. Sometimes you can kind of do like you would right before you tell a dirty joke. You look around and go, it's okay. I can maybe do a little sachet to lose a little altitude. I can add my rear risers to float up and gain some altitude and therefore some distance in the pattern to adapt to what I see, to what I expect. I don't modify my speed that much in the pattern. I try not to. I just do little changes to a little bit of rears, or a little bit to the outside, a little bit to the inside, sometimes a little bit of a sachet, but the main thing is to use heading. That's my recommendation.
And question 5, how can I start to learn to swoop? What should I practice in order to get ready?
Well, if you're not landing beautifully, don't even think about it. If you're not landing exactly where you want it to every single time, in low wind, medium wind, high wind, don't even think about it. If you can't choose a different location than the normal landing area, or a different place in your landing area, and then adapt your pattern and then land there, you're not ready for this stuff. If you haven't made at least 100 jumps this year, I don't think you're ready for it. I don't think you should do it. And I'm not being snooty here. I'm not saying, oh, you can't join the cool swoopers club until you jump through these hoops. I have seen so many broken people. I have helped out so many people after they got hurt and they call me up and they want to do a power session to get over the emotional trauma, to get back on the horse after an accident. I don't want you to have an accident. So the way you avoid that is you become a badass under canopy under normal conditions. Now, obviously, being able to be sort of comfortable and predictive in the parachute that you're currently flying is important. That said, you might have to change parachutes to begin swooping, because your parachute might not be ideal for it. If your parachute has a very short recovery arc, in other words, when you gain speed, it takes that speed back right out of your hands and levels the parachute out against your will, that means you got to turn lower. That means you got to dive lower. So that can be a problem. Here, give me a second. So you need a canopy that dives reasonably well. Not a homesick bowling ball, but something that dives, coasts downhill reasonably well. It has reasonably light front riser pressure too. That helps. So you can keep it diving, because you want to start whatever an acceleration maneuver is that you at the beginning in this process. You want it to start high enough that your brain has time to sort of catch up, calm down, and adapt to what you see. Because when you get sort of excited and speedy in your brain and everything's so fast, you go back to habit and you go back to expectation. And your expectations might not be congruent with your current reality. You might think you're low and you're not low. You might think you're high and you're not high, right? So the ability to start high gives you time to notice what's happening and then make changes based on the reality, not the expectation. Now, when you feel like, okay, I love this parachute. I know this parachute. The brake lines are just the right length. I've done the exercises where I go to full flight and I add the front risers and I look at the back of the parachute and I can see that I've got enough slack. In full flight, got a lot of slack in the brakes. In front risers with the toggles in my hands, I see I got a lot, enough slack in the brakes that I can dive the canopy without the tail being pulled down when I'm front risering, because that's just ridiculous, right? If you're doing brakes and diving input, front risers at the same time, they're sort of self-defeating, and the canopy won't dive effectively. It'll kind of buck around. So once you have sort of verified your canopy is set up for swooping, and you're working with somebody who is a badass teacher in this specific topic, I definitely think it's very, very important to practice going to brakes, spotting your dive loops, surge, grab the dive loops, drive, 1, 2, 3, smoothly let it back out. Again, slow down the canopy and the brakes. Calm your pitter-patter heart. Look. See those dive loops. Surge, dive, 1, 2, 3. Smoothly let it out. You do that over and over and over again. And once you're good at that technique, now you got to find out how much altitude that tends to lose in that process. So you mark altitude while you're in brakes. That's a good way to go. If things kind of slow down, the numbers aren't changing so fast. Not a needle altimeter, a digital that has numbers, right? And if you have a GoPro on, I think sometimes it's a good idea to look at the altimeter. You can even mount an altimeter in front of your GoPro. Just a thought. And you surge at a specific altitude, a round number, easy to remember number. You dive the canopy, 1, 2, 3 on the front, smoothly let it out. And that count of 3, yeah, maybe you can hold it for 4 or 5 seconds on your parachute. There's a lot of variance in how long you can hold the front risers down. Some people can only hold for 3 seconds. Others can hold for 7 or 8 seconds. But either way, you want to be getting it to this higher speed, sustainable situation where you kind of round yourself out and you check your altitude and see how much it loses so that you know when to begin for your actual landing. And of course, there's so much more to talk about here, but this is sort of the beginning of the process. And the last thought I want to add in here is, please practice bailing out as much as you practice the perfect scenario. Though you envision in your mind, I go to the brakes, I relax, I surge, I dive, I see my girlfriend with the camera, I ease it out, I level off, and I swoop past her smiling, looking super cool. Yeah, great, that's your visualization. But what if you start your dive, you hit a little bit of turbulence, and you lose more altitude than you thought? What if you turned a little bit lower than you thought? Maybe something changed about it. Maybe the density altitude is off. In other words, it's a hot, humid day and it loses more than you expected. See, there's a lot of variables here. And if you don't get that, you have no business pulling your front risers near the ground. Please, I made a video for this called Surviving Swooping. And that is, it's a couple hours and it's still not much more than a quick pass over the topic. So you need a coach. But start with that video as my recommendation.
Wow, those were great tips and advices. Thank you so much, Brian, for taking the time to answer our question, the Skydivers questions.
Thanks for joining, and I hope you're all having a great day. And if you're not jumping yet, I hope you will be very, very soon.
And Skyvibers, if you're watching this video, make sure to go down in the description to check the links to Brian's social media profiles, but also his website, Adventure Wisdom, where you can find a ton more great content from Brian. He also has some great online courses that you could take to improve your canopy skills, so make sure to check them out. So wow, I hope you've liked this video. Give it a thumbs up. If so, let me know in the comments if you'd like me to invite more professional people on the channel to answer your questions, and consider watching those other videos from Skydive Vibes. And on that, I'll see you in the next one. Blue skies.